What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. The changes to Bruisers and the tank items, as well as the introduction of 3 new items, are really going to bring Bruisers back into the meta in patch 5.16, in a very big way too, kind of like how it was at the start of Season 5. The meta's come full circle. Also, all of the clips in this video were recorded live on my stream, and I'm going to be streaming again, quite a lot in fact, in the next few months, so definitely check out the links in the description. Anyways, let's get started. So let's start with the champion reworks to Darius, Garen, Skarner, and Mordekaiser. The Darius rework I think is really powerful since he gets a ridiculous amount of bonus damage when he applies 5 stacks of his passive to a target, and although his Q is a little bit slower and has a wind up time now, if you land the edge he gets healed for 10% of his maximum health, so his trading in lane is quite strong, and his base damage with his passive allows you to build a lot of tank items and still be a big threat. He's definitely going to be stronger overall now as they added a lot of utility in, so his kit now is a bit overloaded, and that's definitely a buff. The Garen rework isn't too crazy, he just does a bit more damage to the enemy who is labeled as the villain, and his W got nerfed a little bit in terms of tankiness since you have to farm it up in the early game, but the old W would outscale it once you had more than 150 bonus armor and magic resistance, which is kinda like 2 to 3 items. So the new W is worse in the early game since you have to farm it up, and it's worse in the late game since the old W would outscale it, but it's reasonably better in the mid game. In addition, the utility on his E was increased and it does more damage, and the movement speed on his Q lasts for longer. Overall, he kind of has the same strengths and the same weaknesses and the same playstyle, and is just a little bit better and has a tiny bit more utility. However, I do think he will be strong as he benefits quite a lot from being able to build the new items that I'll go over later. Skarner is an interesting one. A lot of people say he won't be that strong, but I think it's more just that now his playstyle has shifted from a tank jungler to that of a carry jungler, as with the new items you can do a ton of damage, and he has a super easy to land stun now and a really short cooldown on his ultimate, so I actually think Skarner will see a lot of play, as his new kit works really well with the new items. And Mordekaiser. He's certainly the craziest one, and in order to best take advantage of his kit, he needs to be played as a carry in a duo lane, so we might see some comps pop up with an 80 carry mid or top and a Mordekaiser in the bottom lane. I do think he's a decent champion, since the damage on his Q is actually kind of insane. If you get the 3rd hit off, it can do something like 1200 damage consistently with just a couple AP items. But because he has a hard time really fitting the standard meta, I don't think he'll find as much success in solo queue as I might have initially hoped. And we also have 3 new items in this patch. Let's start with the one that has the most damage, Titanic Hydra. This is supposed to be like a tankier option to Ravenous Hydra, as the passive and active are somewhat similar, but instead of lifesteal, it gives 500 health and 25 less attack damage. But I honestly think this item is crazy powerful, as having about 70% or so of the damage of a Ravenous Hydra on an item that has 500 health more and costs the same is really strong, and so far we haven't seen too many items that give attack damage and health other than Black Cleaver, which is a really strong item right now, so this kind of option for a bruiser is huge. The item is gold efficient as well and has much better stats than Black Cleaver, so I think it will be a really popular item and a huge buff primarily on auto attack based bruisers such as Shyvana or Udyr. Next up is Dead Man's Plate. This item is a tank item that gives armor and health, and has a passive that gives movement speed, and a bonus damage and slow on 1 auto attack passive, similar to the way Static Shiv works. Now, for me on paper this item didn't seem too strong at first, since it's not entirely gold efficient, but when you have 100 stacks charged up, the item gives you 50 move speed, and so that is actually pretty strong and worth a lot of gold in terms of stats, and comboed with the on-hit passive, and this is probably going to be the premier armor item for this patch when you don't want to build a Randuin's Omen. The utility it gives is great, and it's actually more gold efficient than the other items that give both armor and health. There isn't a really big item that gives a lot of armor and a lot of health that is actually gold efficient, since the combo of the two stats by nature is extremely powerful to have on one item. So the fact that this item is only about 90% gold efficient before the passives doesn't actually matter at all, and so honestly this item is crazy strong and will definitely see a lot of play. And the third and final item is Sterak's Gauge. This is another item that gives health and damage on it, and by being fairly cheap it fills somewhat of a niche role. This is probably the weakest of the three items though, as it isn't gold efficient, and while the passive is good, it's not always game changing. However, it can be really strong in a lot of situations. In some builds the passive can give you a shield for 1000 health or so, which is pretty crazy, so it's by no means unplayable. I just think that the other two items are ridiculously strong. So with this item just being kind of above average maybe, it does look weak in comparison. It's definitely good enough though, and the passive can be pretty clutch, so I'd be interested to see strategies with this item take place. And we also have the changes to the tank items in general. There's a lot of crazy changes, but in a general sense, it's a slight nerf to armor items in making them more expensive or granting less armor, and a slight buff to magic resistance items in making them cheaper and easier to build. This is interesting because it makes AD carries reasonably stronger in the late game, but also has the effect of making the mid-game burst mages a bit weaker in the late game as well. In the end, I think mages suffer a decent amount, while the armor nerfs and new items will definitely result in a somewhat health stacking bruiser meta, where AD carries will have a much easier time killing tanks in the late game, and Blade of the Rune King is probably going to become more popular as well. But the tanks and bruisers themselves will also have a lot more damage to kill targets with, so in the end I think bruisers come out on top since the benefit they get from the new items is pretty big. But overall I think it's a fair enough change for all parties involved, so I'm very excited for the next patch, and I'm looking forward to the future.
Back of Uber news, halfway on my two shoes, engage into a game that he sure to lose. Major symptomatic fecal flaws due to twisting gutter clips and bats of both in a time. I know it takes a mighty dose of paper. Keep in mind we just skipped the ship well far along the way. Divine